Sometimes, as fantasy world builders, we really want somebody to help us understand what goes into creating a certain era in our world, like the Stone Age, or the Bronze Age, or the medieval period, and so on. So, with that in mind, I decided to create the Era-Defined series on my channel, Just in Time Worlds. I started with hunter-gatherers, and today I'm doing the second video on the Neolithic time period, the revolution from hunter-gatherer into agriculture. Welcome to an era defined by Just-in-Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Today I'll be talking about societal organization, religion, governments, and magic. In the previous video on this age, I covered the basics of living life during this period, as well as the economics. So if you haven't seen that video, maybe go check that one first. When I started this series, I thought I'd be able to do an era per episode, but even the hunter-gatherers took me 40 minutes to cover, and that was the simplest of societies. So these videos are now split up into multi-part videos. Just a short PSA before we dive into the video: I'm not a historian, I'm not an anthropologist, none of those things apply to me. So if an expert says something and I say something to contradict that expert, chances are the expert is correct and I'm wrong. So just bear that in mind as you're watching this. I am approaching history from the perspective of a fantasy world builder, not the perspective of a historian. And speaking of fantasy world building, today's video is sponsored by World Anvil. World Anvil brings you some amazing tools to bring your world to life and to show it off to other people. They have templates for articles including technology, religion, and government. So whether you're building Stone Age civilizations or whether you're building the height of modern civilizations or even futuristic sci-fi, there'll be an article template to cover it. And they give you this timeline tool, which allows you to organize your history and link it up to your maps. If you're interested, you can check out World Anvil on my link down below. And thank you very much to World Anvil both for sponsoring my content and hosting my world of the Sangwheel Chronicles. Okay, enough of that. Let's crack on. When we're talking about the societies of the Neolithic period, we have seen the emergence of villages during this period. So you start seeing people live together in larger communities. Now, I'm sure that you've heard of this concept of the monkey tribe, where you can only really like about 150 people. You can only really know about 150 people. This applies to societies as well. Once your societies start becoming more than 150 people, you need codified laws in order to get people to all work in the same direction. You need to start putting in place those structures to keep your community safe. Under 150 people, you can all gather together. If somebody does something terrible, you can discuss the person's actions, and you can together decide on consequences for those actions. But once you get over that, you no longer know people. You no longer know everybody in your community. So now you have to start having codified law. But having codified law brings with it two giant problems. One, who is going to establish the law? And two, who is going to enforce it? And that is why we start seeing the emergence of the elite class during the Neolithic Revolution as people start living together in villages. So the elite class would be the ones who set your laws and enforce your laws. It generally seems to have started with the religious classes being set up, so things like priests who threaten you with things like, if you anger the gods, you will see your fields laid fallow, your yield will diminish, and you will suffer the consequences of your unholiness. But those priests would have been assisted by a perhaps charismatic leader type class, and also potentially by warrior classes. And then, of course, as your community grows, especially as, let's say, hunter-gatherers start moving into settled villages and also start settling down and farming, you would need to induct these new people into your village, and they would need to gain status in accordance with your laws and customs. And that brings me to the growth of a class society. So we have the elite, but it wouldn't just be the elite. You would then start having craftsmen as a kind of middle layer, and then you would have your menial laborers who would need to work in order to contribute to the society. They would need to be out in the fields, tilling the fields. They would need to be building houses, doing all of your low-skilled activity. And they would live in a kind of near slavery in order to be any kind of member of society. I think that during the Neolithic people, you will also see the emergence of actual slavery. I don't think it would at this point be chattel slavery. I think you would be looking at economic slavery. So you contribute your labor and in return you get food. That kind of level of relationship between, say, a master and a slave. I don't think you will at this point have the sale of slaves. So as I said, just that kind of economic relationship where you basically a slave to your community. Your villages will start growing into towns, especially villages that are well defended. And speaking of defense, you will start seeing the construction of your first defensive type structures. And we can see this in Jericho, which was built nearly 10,000 years ago in 8000 BCE. Now, Jericho was a walled community and it had a tower which potentially could have been used for people to keep watch from. It could have been used as some kind of defensive mechanism. So it had an actual tower and it had a wall around it. And these walls weren't like tiny, they were 4 meters tall. So that's 12 feet, 13 feet walls. That's pretty big in terms of defending your village. But as farmland starts running out, especially arable farmland, you will start seeing raids on villages. Also, remember, this is a period where everything is in flux. So you will still have hunter-gatherer type tribes who would possibly look at agricultural communities as easy prey. They would be, set on raiding those agricultural communities, which means that the agricultural communities would need to start developing defenses. And of course, being sedentary, they would need to defend their area, which would mean things like walls and towers and other defensive work. So I think you would definitely start seeing earthworks and other kind of fortifications, even ditches and moats, walls, towers, all of those kinds of fortification elements. In terms of societal organization, we do have to talk about equality between the sexes at this point, because all evidence points to the hunter-gatherer society being pretty much egalitarian. Like, it didn't matter whether you were a man or a woman, it was your contribution to society that was valued. And indeed, hunter-gatherers had these small female figurines that appear to have formed a fundamental part of their worship, so they potentially worshipped a kind of Mother Nature figure. But during the Neolithic Revolution, patrilineal inheritance and the patriarchy and the suppression and oppression of women becomes a trend. Now, I personally think that the root of that lies in the value of farmland and in wanting your farmland to pass down to your son. So the men would have wanted their children to inherit their farmlands. And the only way that they can be certain that their children are their children is by controlling the procreation of their wives, which I think is one of the big things that led to the kind of patriarchal obsession. But the other part of that lies in the same kind of warrior mentality that starts coming to the fore here. Now, I spoke about, the raids on agriculture environment, farmlands becoming very valuable as, the plots start running out and people become more and more and more, and the farmland is a finite resource. You start having warrior cultures. And warrior cultures, before the advent of technology, which of course is a great equalizer between the sexes, is very male-focused, because when you're talking about the raw brute strength of waging war with a stone axe, you want a man on the battlefield. And in a warrior culture, you have to be concerned about replacing lost warriors, which means that you need more breeding women than you need breeding men. And I do apologize for the term. I don't mean to imply that people with children are breeders. I'm just trying to be concise in my language. Because you would have needed to replace your generation upon generation warriors. And women can only have children, say, once every 2 years. You could push it to once a year, but then your women die very young, because we're not really built for that. But the problem is, because we only carry one child at a time and it takes 9 months, you only need 1 or 2 men to, replace your generation, but you need many women. So I think for all of those reasons, you started seeing the rise of the patriarchy. Now, why this is important for you to consider as a fantasy world builder is because if you want to avoid having a patriarchal society, you need to know what you need to change. And I think there are a couple of places where you can look to for change. And the first is in how we procreate. If you change your sentient species into egg layers, you fundamentally change that dynamic of needing to preserve your females to procreate. You can also potentially look at having magic that make men and women equal on the battlefield, which would remove some of the dynamic of the patriarchy. And then, of course, you could also look at changing the way that you tell whether somebody is somebody's child. If there is a surefire way to make sure that, your children are your children, whether you're male or female, then it becomes easier to justify a non-patriarchal society, because the man will know as well as the woman knowing, obviously, because the woman almost always knows, right? That the child is hers anyway, not necessarily who the father is. So these are the kinds of things that you need to think about when you're creating a egalitarian society. Also, you should consider the impact that your changes will have on your society. You might never have a patriarchal society, depending on the kind of magic that you implement into your world. So think about that impact of your fantastical elements on your societal structure when you're introducing magic, especially in these early societies that were very patriarchal. I have already mentioned religion, and we do, during this period, definitely see the rise of religion. We see animism giving way to the first polytheistic religions. So religions with gods of the god of thunder, instead of, the world being inhabited with spirits, you start having gods, and you start seeing an actual religious class, a class of priests. You start having churches. So you can definitely see the rise of organized religion. It is not yet huge temples. It is not yet interconnected, but you are moving away from your early shamanism type religions, which are just about working with the spirits, to having actual deities at this point. And if you enjoyed that discussion about your organization of society, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about the cultures of the Neolithic agricultural revolution. In terms of actual art objects, your art objects at this point would be largely functional things. So it'll be things like you have this pot that is a container for wheat that also has like little wheat sheaf engraved on them. Or you will have woven baskets that also form a pattern that you can, trace out with your fingers and see with your eyes. So maybe you use red grasses to, put a band around the top of the basket, or you use kind of a golden grass to make the handle. Things like that would definitely form part of your art. And that's where your craftsman of your specialized labor comes in. You would also definitely start seeing, you would also see a lot of clothing decoration, and clothing would start becoming an art form. I don't think that you would have a huge amount of jewelry as an art form yet. That comes later during the Bronze Age. But certainly they were working with gold and copper, but they were cold working it. So at most they were kind of heating it up a little so that it doesn't break under being hammered by, a stone axe. But they're not yet smelting it and working with the molten ore. They don't have that level of control over fire at this point. In terms of music, you would definitely have singing voices, of course. You also definitely have flutes, you have drums, and you might even start having your early stringed instruments. So like strings probably with a bow at this point. You're not likely to have finger instruments necessarily. And in terms of performing arts, this is where you will start seeing storytellers, especially storytellers who potentially move around with merchants from village to village, taking the news in the form of stories and telling new stories and new myths of the time before. Our oldest myth comes from the Bronze Age, but I'm pretty certain that there were verbal and oral traditions that go back to the Stone Age period. You will at this point start seeing the slow development of games and hobbies. The Mesoamericans had a game that they played with a rubber ball where you had to keep the ball inside of a confined area. And that was during the kind of late Stone Age period. So you might very well start seeing games develop alongside hobbies. You would also see things like bathhouses start being a thing. Though at this point they won't be like the Bronze Age bathhouses. There'll be things like sweat lodges and saunas. And you would also potentially have great value being put into hot springs. So you would see hot springs as like a valuable resource where you could go to potentially commune with the gods and clean yourself. I think you would start seeing rituals around cleanliness becoming a thing during this period. And certainly there is a long association of cleaning yourself before engaging in any kind of religious rituals. In terms of your moments of life, so birth and death, your births at this point, I don't think you would engage in totemism as much. So I don't think that a child would be assigned a totem by the shaman the way they potentially would during the Paleolithic period. But I think that it would still be a habit to not count a child as fully born until they're around 2 years old or so, because your medical technology is still utterly crap at this period. So your infant mortality is super high. That being the case, you probably want to wait a little bit before naming the child and getting fully invested in them as a person to make sure that they're actually going to make it through that early period of infancy. And burial would be something that you would do potentially in your house. We can see from the archaeological record that people were buried under the floors of their houses, especially in the tell houses, which I spoke about in my first video. So you would bury your father, burn his house down, and then build your house on top of his remains and his house, which I think is a very interesting approach to a burial. It's certainly not what I would want to do, but then I didn't grow up in that society. But it is an interesting approach to burial. We also see the passage tombs, as I spoke about in my first video. And of course, there were people buried in megalithic structures. So your elites might very well be being buried in the megalithic structures. We also see here the emergence of the first mass graves, potentially the losers of wars, of the first wars that occur as people battle over farmland and engage in aggressive conflict resolution. You would definitely have some kind of mating ritual. You probably also have people engaging in polygyny at this point, which is one man, multiple women kind of marriage setup. I don't think you would necessarily be going monogamous yet at this point, like one-to-one relationship. I think you would probably still at this point be your one male to multiple females. There might also be at this point societies where you have multiple men to a single female, depending on how many men are born vis-a-vis females, and depending on your scarcity of resources. If your resources are such that it requires multiple men's labor to, supply a woman's children with sufficient food to survive, you are very likely to engage in polyamory, which is multiple men marrying a single woman. And if you enjoyed that discussion around the potential culture of the Neolithic period, hit the thumbs up button, and let's talk about magic. Like with the Paleolithic period, do be aware that if you give your mages complete control over fire, you are likely to move out of the Stone Age super fast. Just because at that point you can make fire hot enough to smelt ore with. And once you can do that, you can move out of the Stone Age, as people prefer to make weapons from copper and eventually figure out how to take iron and make it into steel. So be careful of your fire magics. This is the point of societal development where I see a lot of divine type magic, a lot of priest magic, whether it's real or, fakery and just kind of the interpretation of omens, kind of naturalistic magic. Definitely, I think you're going to see priests claiming magic at the very least. And if you have real magic in your world, this is almost certainly the point where anybody who shows magical talent and starts developing magic, if it's not completely ubiquitous, will be incorporated into the priesthood by the other priests. They will not have a choice. They will just be taken into the religion. You will have control exercised over mages by either the leadership elite or the priestly elite or both. You might start seeing a kind of druidism magic appear towards the later end of the Neolithic period. Check out my video on druidism over there in the information card. You could also have magic based around components and magic based around herbs, especially kind of like getting high, getting drunk, and seeing things, moving into the spirit world, manipulating the spirits. That kind of magic would definitely still be around. And you would still have your component type magics and your sympathetic magics based on that. I think you might start seeing magical items start appearing around this period, where you can see an item infused by the spirits that can increase the yield of a farm and that kind of thing. Speaking of the yield of a farm, any magic in your world that actually can increase a farm's yield or that can control weather would be incredibly useful. It would be seen as a real asset by your world, and control over people who can cast that kind of magic would be in very high demand. I could see like weather witches being kidnapped from one village to the next in an attempt to increase your crop yields. Remember, these people are wrestling with the earth to try and get food out of her. They don't have advanced technologies yet. They're maybe just past the slash and burn period. Like somebody who can make the earth fertile again, somebody who can cause trees to just sprout from the ground, and you can slash and burn that field all over again. Wow, that would be such an incredibly valuable resource. So don't just think of magic in this point in terms of the powers that you give the individual. Consider the impact that it has on this society and how they would control those mages and what they would seek to get out of them. And if the mages live free, how? Do they have the power to defend themselves? Do they band together in communities? Are there codified laws that control how they should be treated? And if so, how did those codified laws come into being? And if you enjoyed that discussion of your magical elements of your Neolithic revolution, hit the thumbs up button. And let's talk about the things to remember when creating your Neolithic society. This is a time period of great flux. You would have sedentary settlements starting out, but you would still have semi-nomadic people. You would still have a lot of hunter-gatherers. You would see the start of conflict, but you wouldn't yet have large armies. You would see laws being codified in some communities, while others still live in tribes under 150 people and just gather together and establish their own rule set because they all know and love each other. You would have naturalistic magic, and if it's real, control over those mages would be a large part of the resources that you would need to have control over. You definitely have the emergence of an elite class at this point, and probably the emergence of craftspeople as a kind of middle class who make your items. At this point, your ownership and so on, your ownership of lands and so on is probably still fairly community focused. You're still probably fairly community focused in terms of your culture, but you are starting to see the emergence of the individual. And unless you do something to combat it, you're probably heading into a patriarchal society as conflict become a bigger thing and as land scarcity becomes a problem that you need to address. And those are my thoughts on setting up a Neolithic community in a fantasy world. If you want to support the channel, you can hit the join button and get access to these cool perks. If you would like my help in world building, you can engage my services on my Ko-fi page. If you would like something back for your support of the channel, don't forget about my books. You can buy them from any of the retailers on the links down below. And if you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out my video on religions in a fantasy world. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time Worlds.